eyes say to me, you let me hold. Appreciate you being around. Help me get. I'll ride home every day, and I'll say.
Before John, Paul, George and Ringo became the Beatles, they were simply four teenagers from Liverpool. Never could John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Ringo Starr have imagined they would go on to form one of the most successful groups in modern history, influencing the popular culture in not only music, but also fashion, film and global representation. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, it was difficult to imagine a band hailing from the relatively poor northwest port city of Liverpool, England, could get a gig in the thriving London music scene of the South, let alone export their eventual homegrown success to a world eagerly opening up to the counterculture movement of the 60s and the burgeoning phenomenon that was called rock and roll. A fateful meeting between two music-loving teenagers in 1957 is where it all began. 16-year-old rhythm guitarist Lennon, the son of a merchant seaman, was performing with the Quarrymen, a skiffle folk music blended with jazz or blues band booked to perform at events at a church fete in Woolton, Liverpool. While setting up their instruments for the evening performance, the band's bass player introduced Lennon to a classmate, 15-year-old McCartney, who would join in on a couple of numbers that night and soon would be offered a permanent spot in the Quarrymen. Harrison, the son of a bus conductor and shop assistant, joined the Quarrymen as lead guitarist at age 15. Influenced by rockabilly, his guitar licks would help shape the group's early sound. Though still performing as the Quarrymen, Lennon, McCartney and Harrison would go on to form the core that would soon become the Beatles. Throughout 1958 and 1959 the Quarrymen gigged whenever they could, including local parties and family events such as the reception for Harrison's brother's wedding. Professional bookings included venues such as the Casbah Coffee Club in Liverpool and Hippodrome in Manchester. The name of the band was in flux during this period, which would witness the group play under monikers Johnny and the Moondogs as well as the Silver Beatles and the Silver Beats. An art school student and friend of Lennon's, Stuart Sutcliffe, was brought into the band to play bass. Sutcliffe and Lennon are often credited with coining the name the Beatles, though various stories abound on the actual origins. The name that would become synonymous with modern music was a combination of Beatles and beat, hence the Beatles. In 1960 and the first half of 1961, the group performed at venues including social clubs and dance halls around England and Scotland, but keeping a regular drummer was proving to be difficult. On short notice, they recruited Pete Best, whom they had seen play at Casbah Coffee Club. Lennon, Harrison, McCartney, Sutcliffe and Best left England in August 1960. Playing regular gigs at the Indra Club, the larger Kaiserkeller and the Top 10 Club in Hamburg forged them as a group. The Beatles performed in Hamburg on and off from 1960 through in 1962 with engagements back in Liverpool interspersed. It was at a performance at hometown venue the Cavern Club where Brian Epstein first saw the group play. Epstein was curious after hearing mention of them in his family-owned record store and in the pages of Mersey Beat magazine. He returned to take in the show a few more times, and on December 10, 1961, Epstein approached the band about managing them, and a 5-year contract was signed in January 1962. That year would prove to be momentous for the Beatles. On April 10 Sutcliffe died of a brain hemorrhage. June 6 marked the first time the group would record at EMI Studios located at 3 Abbey Road, St John's Wood, London. Produced by George Martin, who would go on to be extensively involved in their first albums, they recorded 4 songs: Love Me Do, Bésame Mucho, Ask Me Why and P.S. I Love You. Martin was impressed with the group but believed Best was not up to the job as drummer. Epstein fired Best on August 16 and replaced him with 21-year-old Starr, the son of local confectionaires who had been playing with bands in the area. Starr made his debut with TTE Beatles 2 days later. However, here are facts about the Beatles. The Lennon family's feud. None of the Beatles had particularly easy beginnings, but special mention must be made for the circumstances under which John Lennon was raised. Born in 1940, Lennon's father was barely present for the early days of John's life. The real conflict came between his mother Julia and his aunt Mimi. These two women, who were vastly different in both temperament and in social status, vied for control of the young John for much of his youth. Perhaps the most well-known story about John's childhood took place at the age of 5, when his father forced him to choose between him or his mother. John first chose Alfred, but then ran up the street to his mother in tears when she left. Alfred disappeared after that, not to appear again until after the Beatles found fame. These experiences had an effect on Lennon as a youth. He led gangs, shoplifted, and bullied fellow students and teachers alike. This rebellious streak would famously continue into adulthood. Star Dickensian childhood. While Lennon's childhood was troubled, however, Ringo Starr's was downright nightmarish. Starr-born Richard Starkey had his father walk out on him when he was 4. He also fell victim to a host of diseases throughout his childhood, including appendicitis, peritonitis, and even tuberculosis. That last one meant he was forced to spend 2 years in a sanatorium. Luckily, things started to look up from there. His stepfather began to encourage the young boy's interest in music during his time in the sanatorium, and he was given his first drum kit for Christmas in 1957, 2 years after his release. Only a few years later he joined his first proper band, changed his name to Ringo Starr, and while touring in Germany met a group of talented young musicians on residency in Hamburg who were calling themselves the Beatles. The rest is history. Struggles in America. The Beatles are renowned for leading the so-called British invasion of America, firmly establishing themselves as one of the country's most successful groups from overseas. That success didn't come easy. At first, the band couldn't even land a contract with their own label's American counterpart. When their music was finally issued in America, they saw very little circulation, and their first imprint in America even spelled the band's name incorrectly, Beatles. The Beatles finally received some news coverage thanks to a morning segment on CBS which aired on November 22, 1963, now better remembered as the day JFK was shot. Please Please Me, From Me to You, and She Loves You were all flops, with some listeners phoning into radio stations to try to get them to stop playing the band's music. It wasn't until their legendary debut on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964 that the Beatles broke America for good. The slow death of the Beatles. Tensions had already begun to rise among the Beatles after John Lennon took the unprecedented move of allowing an outsider, Yoko Ono, into the band's recording sessions. The relationship between the two lovers and the rest of the group only deteriorated further when Ono and Lennon began using heroin. Meanwhile, McCartney's domineering attitude had, according to Rolling Stone, become noxious and condescending to the other members of the band. Harrison begun to feel sidelined by McCartney and Lennon, a matter made all the worse as Ono's effect on the group became more pronounced. Eventually Harrison could take no more. He quit the band on January 10, 1969. A begrudging reconciliation was eventually found between Harrison, Lennon, and Yoko, but things remained tense. The Beatles played their last live show on the rooftop of their label's offices in London on January 29. At the end of 1969, after a series of battles and feuds over the band's finances, Lennon quit the band. McCartney left as the decade turned, and by 1971 the Beatles came to a final end.